On the brachium. Ready? Here we go. Getting ready to start. Any minute, I'm going to start real soon. This was the arm. And in life, when you had that intact chest, right, we had those xiphyohumerales, pectoralis minor, pectoralis major, pectorantebrachialis. On this side, the pectorantebrachialis is cut in the middle and pushed forward. And this is the brachium. And what's visible on the brachium is an epitrochlearis, a thin sheet of muscle covering part of the brachium towards the posterior. And then this smooth muscle here, which is called the biceps brachii muscle. And then underneath, between them, would have been an anconeus, but I've declared that not interesting. I said, that's not interesting, forget about it. On the lateral view, right, these are the trapezoids, these are the deltoids, like spinal deltoid, and in here would be a chromodeltoid. And this is clavobrachialis coming down the front of the arm. So we push that a little forward. We have muscles on the front of the arm, towards the outside, is called brachialis. Brachialis, like biceps brachii, is a flexor of the forearm, antebrachial, flexes the forearm up, or flexes the elbow. And these ones are triceps heads, triceps. And a cat really does have 3 heads, a lateral head, a long head, and between them a medial head, 1, 2, 3. Okay, and then from here on, we're looking at the forearm, a muscle missing in this cat. And I tried to find it on the side, and I probably ripped it. I don't think it's preserved well, but that's the start of it. So this was brachialis, and this is a brachioradialis, which have run, this is it here, you know, just sort of discontinuous, and it pulls away from the forearm. So when you look at pictures of it in the book, you'll see there's kind of a gap. And then we're on the forearm itself, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4 muscles radiating across the extensor surface, right? This is the extensor carpi radialis. Your book points out 2 heads, we're not subdividing. On the other side of it is extensor carpi ulnaris. And so those ones are extensor carpi go to the wrist. One's on the ulnar side and one's on the ulnar side and one's on the radial side. Ulnar side, elbow, ulnar side, elbow. So you see extensor carpi ulnaris. In between them are 2 muscles called extensor digitorums. The first one towards the inside is extensor digitorum communis, and then the second one is extensor digitorum lateralis, more lateral, towards the outside in that view. This here thing I'm wearing pinches right here and helps protect where the extensor carpi ulnaris and the extensor digitorum lateralis insert on the olecranon process, and so that's where tendinitis occurs from all my tennis playing that I don't do. If you split down under the surface of the bones where you can get down closer to the radius and all themselves, there's 2 muscles underneath here. One is called the adductor pollicis longus, as most of what we see there. This region is adductor pollicis longus, where a pollicis is a reference to the thumb. Very good. And above that, this region is called the supinator, and there's a little, if you got to get close, but they are separate muscles. There's a thin region of connective tissue you can see separating an upper supinator, which is very proximal in its location and rotates the whole arm, versus adductor pollicis longus, which is going to be named because in humans it's going to end up on the thumb, extending the thumb. Hitchhike out of here. This is the flexor surface, okay? This is still extensor carpi radialis visible there. And there's a muscle right here which is somewhat triangular shaped, right? It has a broad base here on the inside of the elbow, and then gets very slender and becomes just a tendon heading down. That's called the pronator teres. The opposite of supination is pronation. So this is supination. This muscle is going to pull the arm over, and it's found mostly in the proximal third of the antebrachium. That leaves 3 sort of visible muscles in the intact forearm. On the innermost margin is the flexor carpi radialis, the sort of partner to the extensor carpi radialis. So one's going to pull the wrist down, one's going to pull it up on the inside. If we go to the outside, we have flexor carpi ulnaris. Here's extensor carpi ulnaris. Here's flexor carpi ulnaris. Again, same idea, but on the outside of the wrist. And in between them, you only see one muscle superficially. It's called the flexor digitorum superficialis. If we move that, we get to the flexor digitorum profundus. So there are two flexor digitorum muscles, but instead of being side by side in the flexor area, this smooth surface you see there, there's one on top of the other. A superficial one and a profundus, which means deep. Okay, profound. And then if we separate all of that and get down to the bone again, on the bone, usually kind of beat up by the time you get down to it, at least I do, is pronator quadratus, another pronator muscle associated functionally with the pronator teres. And that's the muscles of the brachium and antebrachium. Right, so once upon a time you did the lower back. So if we follow down the lower back, we have like longissimus dorsi muscles. Then right on the spine, we're multifidus spinae. And right around here is where we have the ilium here, like the hips are right in here. So these are gluteus muscles. This region right here, this is gluteus maximus, which is not very impressive, this region. And then in front of that is the gluteus medius, which is considerably bigger in a cat than the maximus. And if we open up the medius, I find two more muscles of note. This one that we see a shiny tendon running this way is gluteus minimus, and sitting on top of it, okay, maybe slightly sliced, is piriformis. So lowest is gluteus minimus, above it is piriformis, and above that is gluteus medius, behind that is gluteus maximus. Now on the further behind that, on the leg, functioning the leg, this is caudal femoralis, which is just in front of the much larger biceps femoris. Below the gluteus muscles is an irregularly shaped muscle. It comes a little bit here, goes here, comes over here. That's called the tensor fasciae latae. It's associated with the tendon, now removed, little spits of it left, which had covered the whole outside of the limb. That's called the fasciae latae. In you, it's called the IT band. In front of that, visible from the outside, a lateral view, is the sartorius. If we flip the leg to the inside, we're looking at the surface of the leg. We see a sartorius here that we can see just a little bit now. See, in cats, it's a broader sheet on the medial surface, and behind it, another broad sheet covering the inside of the leg is called the gracilis. Sartorius, gracilis. Sartorius is cut. Open it up, and we've got on the front of the leg the quadriceps. What had been under the fasciae latae is called the vastus lateralis. On the inner margin, just in front of like the femoral blood vessels coming down here, is the vastus medialis. In between them, covered with a lot of tough connective tissue, is called the rectus femoris. And then under them, you can see some dark fibers in there. That's vastus intermedius. Vastus medialis, vastus lateralis, vastus intermedius, plus the rectus femoris adds up to 4. It's your quadriceps, which collectively extend the knee, causing the shank to extend out. Under the gracilis, there's a series of muscles on the inner thigh. Dark one up here, doesn't really preserve well, is called the pectineus. Immediately in front of that, pretty decent as that goes, adductor longus. Behind that, adductor femoris. And then there's these two with funky names, the semimembranosus and the semitendinosus. Semimembranosus and semitendinosus cross the knee along with the biceps femoris. These are the flexors of the knee, collectively called hamstrings in a colloquial sense, but that's not technically an anatomical term. Okay. In humans, these two muscles run right down the back of the femur. Okay. Onto the shank. Well, first we'll look at the calf. This is the big calf muscles called the gastrocnemius. There's a lateral head and a medial head. On the lateral surface, if you look underneath the lateral surface, you'll see a dark muscle underneath it. That's the soleus muscle. It's very dark, full of myoglobin. It must be aerobic, more aerobic. And then in between these two, there's a plantaris muscle. You can see that kind of whitish connective tissue. There's a different muscle between the two gastrocnemius heads called plantaris. All of those muscles, gastrocnemius, soleus, plantaris, connect through a tough tendon here. It's called the calcaneal tendon, aka the Achilles tendon, which inserts here on the calcaneal bone or heel bone. On the shank itself, we see an exposed bit of bone. To the outside is going to be the extensor surface. The first one is called a tibialis anterior. Tibialis anterior is here. This is called extensor digitorum longus. And when you get behind that, we're called peroneus muscles. A whole bunch in this region. There's a few of them. You can say peroneus muscles. So tibialis anterior, extensor digitorum longus, peroneus. On the medial surface, flexor digitorum longus. Corresponding name to extensor digitorum longus, flexor. The tibialis posterior also exists, but it's real tiny and tucked underneath it. So there's a tendon here you can see, and then a little bit of muscle. So clearly it's more or less vestigial. It's not nearly the kind of tibialis anterior is going to raise the toes. This is going to do the opposite effect, kind of wrapping around the bottom of the foot, but not with much strength. Immediately behind the flexor digitorum longus is a flexor hallucis longus, which is coming down here and is going to go down the big toe side. Beyond that, you're back to the peroneus muscles. On the inside of the knee, up high, in this region is a triangular-shaped muscle called the popliteus. Popliteus. The back of the knee is called the popliteal fossa. This happens, so that's that same name. This is the popliteus. It's going to twist the knee slightly in, but in a cat, it's clearly not very robust, so it's not going to be real powerful for that purpose. Oh, and I just forgot, while we're here, this is the iliopsoas complex found. It's going to pull the femur forward. This is the iliopsoas complex. The main portion of it in the middle is called the psoas major. On the inside, see a little bit of a tendon there. That's going to be psoas minor. To the inside, psoas major again, and on the outside is going to be, I guess it's kind of still enmeshed into it. That silver bit there is the tendon of the iliacus. So it's iliacus, psoas major, psoas minor on the inside. Together they make an iliopsoas complex, which in cattle is called the tenderloin. And if you eat beef, it's delicious. If you don't eat beef, here's your lower back, right? When we get to the lower back, we'll get to the hip bones. Okay, the ilium is going to be out here. These are the gluteus muscles here. This region, this is the gluteus medius, and this is the gluteus maximus. It still has some connective tissue over it, separate from this thing behind it. Gluteus maximus, gluteus medius, yeah. And when you open up the gluteus medius, this longitudinal fibers right here is the gluteus minimus, running along this way. You can still see them. These fibers is a chopped up, destroyed piriformis.
Okay.
Piriformis, gluteus minimus, gluteus medius, gluteus maximus. Behind the gluteus maximus is the caudal femoralis. Behind that is the biceps femoris.
As opposed to the biceps.
More distal to the gluteus medius is the tensor fascia latae, which is connected to a broad tendinous sheet that covers a part of the outside of the leg called the fascia latae. Tensor fascia latae is kind of irregularly shaped. Also visible on the outside margin of the leg here is sartorius. And in this area would have been covered by that by that fascia latae, but this is what's visible now. It's called the vastus lateralis. If we look, this is that sartorius, and here's the sartorius on the inside, and this is called gracilis. So in the intact limb, you see those two muscles evident. And I'm going to finish bisecting the sartorius so we can reflect it. Right, that's the sartorius. And so now what's on the front of the leg is called the quadriceps complex, or quadriceps femoris. This is what we just mentioned called vastus lateralis. This is vastus medialis. Between them, heavily covered with connective tissue, is the rectus femoris.
That?
Yes. Strong sheet of connective tissue over it. And then if we go dive deep between the rectus femoris and the vastus medialis, you see darker fibers in here, vastus intermedius.
Those ones?
Vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, vastus intermedius, rectus femoris. That's four. It makes a quadriceps femoris complex.
That's two.
On the back of the leg, we have pull up the gracilis, and we expose muscles on the inside of the thigh This is a very nice version of things. This is the pectineus, adductor longus, adductor femoris, semimembranosus, and semitendinosus. Semimembranosus, semitendinosus are here, along with the biceps femoris, our knee flexors, collectively called the
Achilles tendon.
flex the knee. You use them when you run fast.
Your hamstring.
That's right. Which is not really an anatomical term, but that's what makes up your hamstring. Semimembranosus, semitendinosus, and biceps femoris.
Oh.
Artie's kid. Okay, so here's would be the location of the sternum, right? There's the pectoral antebrachialis, and this is the lower jaw here, right? So that's the mandible where the two dentary bones are fusing here, the dentary or mandibular symphysis. And in between, this little bit of blue schmutz here is the location of the transverse jugular, where embedded in there would be the free-floating hyoid bone. From the sternum to the hyoid bone runs the sternohyoids. Lateral to that, from the sternum to the mastoid, run the sternomastoids. Lateral to that, I did a little bit better job on this side. This is clavotrapezius. This is clavobrachialis. That indentation is about where the clavicle is. And here, not perfectly cleaned up, is a muscle coming from the clavicle and heading to the mastoid, separate from that thing. That's called the clitomastoid. Together, this is the sternocleidomastoid complex, if you like, because they kind of fuse together when they get by the head. Trachea is here, underneath the sternohyoid. If we look on the side of the trachea, there's a muscle runs from the sternum, inserting on the larynx near the thyroid gland. Is called the sternothyroid. And there's a muscle that begins very close to that. This is what he'll be yelling tonight, though. This is called the thyrohyoid. It starts on the larynx. You can see it there. Starts on the larynx where the sternothyroid ends, and it goes from that same location to the hyoid, thyrohyoid. Okay, good. Okay, looking further forward, here's that lower jaw. This is again is the hyoid. Associated with the lower jaw, fanning out on each side, are the digastrics, here and here. Technically, it's the anterior belly, the digastric, and it gets skinny as it goes down into this hole, and it'll get fat again and have a second belly. That's why it's called digastric. We'll talk about that in lecture at some point. And this is the muscle that covers the floor of the mouth. It's called the mylohyoid. Mylohyoid is running right across it, a thin sheet. If I push that out of the way on one side, which is what happened over here, you see a longitudinal muscle from here to here, right in the midline, running from the hyoid to the lower jaw. That's called the geniohyoid. Lateral to that, starting at the hyoid and running deep and darker right here, this muscle, hyoid to tongue, hyoglossus. Lateral to that, getting less distinct and a little bit torn up, a little soft in here, running from the tongue to the mastoid area or hyoid, it's the styloid really, but they don't have much of a styloid. That's called the styloglossus, going from the base of the skull to the tongue. So these muscles, these two, the one that ends with glossus, of course, are going to the tongue, manipulating the position of the tongue. The tongue itself is a muscle that's doing moving around, but those help anchor it and move it about. The other one that's real tiny, and I think I saw what was left of it, is a stylohyoid, which comes across like the skinny part of the middle of the digastric. But this little bit of muscle right here, you see a tiny bit of muscle right there. I believe that's stylohyoid. That's a pretty lousy one. Okay. There's your neck. Finis. Ferme. C'est tout. For this, look up ahead. Look at that. That's the bone there. Remember that temporal line? That's the temporalis muscle here and here, covered in nice white tendon. And this is the masseter right right here. I didn't dissect that.
Pretty cheeky.
I did.
They used to have a I know I didn't because they used to have a
We cut
gland.
some
I mean,
nerves.
a duct, a parotid duct over
Yeah,
it.
we
It's-
cut 'em.
It's gone. Apparently,
that.
this
Attached
doesn't
to
get
the
have
skin.
'em.
Yeah, we cut that.
Masseter temporalis. They both close the jaw,
You
slightly
indented
different
it.
angles of attack, slightly different lever
It's
actions.
indented now.
Got a little finger.
Temporalis provides for
Fingerprint.
greater force in the cheek teeth for that shearing action. Cheek